February 1943. The desolate hills of Tunisia. This was supposed to be the U.S. Army's grand debut against the German Wehrmacht. Instead, it was a slaughter. Along dusty desert tracks, the wreckage of American armor smolders. M3 Stuarts and even new M4 Shermans abandoned and burning. Columns of dazed soldiers stream eastward, their units shattered, their officers gone. This was not a tactical withdrawal, it was a brutal first lesson in modern warfare. This catastrophe would be studied intensely by both sides. But they would draw two dangerously different conclusions from the wreckage. The event that produced this wreckage has a name, the Battle of Kasserine Pass. And this story isn't about the humiliation of a single defeat. It's about a fatal misdiagnosis. The battle became a Rorschach test for two armies. Where one saw a problem to be solved, the other saw a weakness to be exploited. A weakness they believed was permanent. For the Americans, Kasserine was a shock to the system, a public and painful failure that reverberated all the way to Washington. The reports landing on General Eisenhower's desk were not just accounts of tactical setbacks. They were a systematic indictment of the entire American way of war. Units didn't communicate. Air and ground forces acted as if they were in two different wars. Artillery was poorly coordinated. Commanders trained in the slow, methodical exercises of stateside maneuvers were paralyzed by the speed and violence of the German Blitz. The American army that landed in North Africa believed it was ready. Kasserine proved it was not. It was a brutal but necessary education. The tuition was paid with lives and steel, but the lesson was clear. Adapt or be annihilated. For the Germans, the conclusion was simpler and far more dangerous. The veterans of the Africa Corps, men who had fought from El Alamein to the borders of Egypt and back, looked at their new opponents with something approaching professional contempt. They saw an army of amateurs. An army that relied on its equipment but didn't know how to use it. An army whose soldiers surrendered too easily and whose officers lacked the ruthless, decisive instinct for battle. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the architect of the victory, saw it himself. His diagnosis was that the American soldier was poorly trained and crucially poorly led, and in February 1943 he was absolutely right. The American performance was a catalog of errors. The German mistake was not in their assessment of the battle, but in their projection for the war. They mistook a snapshot of incompetence for a permanent portrait of their enemy. They saw a soft army from a decadent democracy and concluded it could never produce the hardened soldiers needed to win. This is the central paradox of Kasserine Pass. The German analysis of American weakness was correct in every tactical detail, but their strategic conclusion that this weakness was inherent and incurable was catastrophically wrong. They won the battle so completely, so decisively, that it confirmed their deepest prejudices, and in doing so, it blinded them. This brings us to our central question: how did a brilliant tactical victory become an intellectual trap? Why did winning a battle convince the German military that they understood their enemy when in fact they had just witnessed the painful birth of the force that would ultimately destroy them? To understand how the Germans got it so wrong, we must first understand the two armies that met in the Tunisian hills. One confident and untested, the other battle-hardened and contemptuous. To understand the disaster that was about to unfold, you must first understand the chasm that separated the two armies. It was not a gap measured in miles, but in experience, philosophy, and reality. On one side stood the U.S. Second Corps. In the grand ledger of war, their assets were impressive. They were the product of the world's greatest industrial power. A torrent of men and material poured onto the shores of North Africa. They had new M4 Sherman tanks, superior in many ways to the German Panzer III and IVs they would face. They had fleets of trucks, mountains of supplies, and a seemingly endless stream of fresh soldiers. By every metric of production and logistics, they were formidable. But an army is not an assembly line. It is a living, breathing organism. And this one had yet to draw its first breath in combat. Its brain was steeped in theory. The doctrine that guided the American Army of 1942 was a product of peacetime, of carefully scripted maneuvers in the fields of Louisiana and the deserts of California. It was a doctrine that worshipped firepower and process. Problems were to be solved with methodical artillery barges and overwhelming numbers. It was logical, rational, and completely detached from the chaotic, improvisational violence of a real war against a first-rate opponent. The American officer corps was trained to follow the manual. The Germans they were about to face had written their own. Nothing symbolized this disconnect more than the commander of the Second Corps, Lieutenant General Lloyd Friedendahl. Friedendahl was an army man through and through, a product of the system. But his primary concerns in Tunisia seemed to be engineering, not combat. His obsession was the construction of his command post. Located more than 70 meters behind the front lines, it was not a tent, nor a repurposed building. It was a fortress. For 3 weeks, a battalion of Army engineers, men, and equipment desperately needed to build bridges and clear minefields at the front were instead tasked with blasting a sprawling complex of tunnels and chambers out of a rocky hillside. It was a command bunker worthy of a Bond villain, complete with concrete floors and separate entrances and exits, all built to withstand an apocalyptic air raid that was never a remote possibility. From this subterranean palace, Friedendahl attempted to command. His physical distance was matched by his mental detachment. He rarely visited the front. His orders to subordinate commanders were notoriously vague, a bizarre mix of slang and homespun jargon that left his officers bewildered. He would refer to units on the map not by their designations, but as the boys on the hill. Instead of clear, concise commands, he offered encouragement, like, "Go get them." He would draw lines on a map and tell a commander to plug the hole without any sense of the terrain or the disposition of the enemy. It was leadership by remote control, and the signal was fatally weak. His men spread thin across a vast and confusing landscape of arid plains and jagged hills, felt like they were on their own. They were across that landscape, watching, waiting, was an entirely different kind of army. The men of the German Panzer Arma Africa were the polar opposite of their new foe. They were not rich. Their supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. Their equipment was a patchwork of worn-out panzers, captured British trucks, and Italian support vehicles. Their uniforms were faded and tattered, but they possessed a currency far more valuable than factory-fresh equipment. 2 years of brutal, non-stop combat experience. These were the veterans of the Africa Corps. They were the survivors of Crusader Gazala and El Alamein. The desert was their home. They knew how to navigate its featureless plains, how to find water, how to keep their engines running in a sandstorm. They were masters of a new kind of warfare, a fluid, high-speed ballet of maneuver and firepower. Their doctrine was not found in a book, it was etched into their muscle memory. At the heart of this doctrine was the concept of Gebundenen Waffen, combined arms combat. To the Germans, this was not a slogan, it was a science. Their panzer divisions were not just collections of tanks. They were a symphony of destruction, where every instrument played its part. The tanks, the nimble Panzer IIIs, and the more powerful Panzer IVs were the visible fist. But the true killer was the supporting cast. The infantry, riding in half-tracks, would pin down enemy positions. The Stuka dive bombers would act as flying artillery, terrorizing enemy morale. And then there was the 88. The 8.8 centimeter flat gun was on paper an anti-aircraft weapon. But the men of the Africa Corps had long ago discovered its true calling. Fired horizontally, its high-velocity shell could slice through the armor of any Allied tank from over a mile away. The Germans developed a simple but lethally effective tactic. They would use their panzers as bait, feigning an attack or a retreat to lure Allied armor forward. The confident Allied tankers would give chase only to run headlong into a hidden screen of Dugan 88s. The first they would know of the trap was when their comrades' tanks began to explode around them. It was a tactic the Americans had read about in intelligence briefings. They were about to experience it firsthand. The German soldiers looked at the newly arrived Americans with a professional's disdain for an amateur. They saw the neat rows of American tents, the careless way they parked their vehicles in tidy lines, perfect for an artillery strike. They listened on the radio as American units broke radio silence to chatter about mail from home. They saw an army playing at war. Their commander, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, shared their assessment. Rommel was the living embodiment of everything Friedendahl was not. He commanded from the front, often flying in a light Storch aircraft to survey the battlefield himself or racing between units in his command half-track. Grarf, his presence was electric, his decisions instantaneous. While Friedendahl was safe in his bunker, Rommel was at the Scherpen, the decisive point of the battle, personally directing the flow of combat. In early February 1943, Rommel and the German High Command saw a unique opportunity. The American forces were overextended, their leadership was hesitant, and their troops were untested. A sharp, decisive blow could do more than just win a local victory. It could inflict a psychological wound so deep that it might shatter the morale of the entire American expeditionary force. It could expose the alliance between the Americans and the British as fragile, and perhaps even drive a wedge between them. It was a chance to prove that the industrial might of America was no match for the martial spirit and experience of the Wehrmacht. For the Germans, this was not just another battle. It was to be a masterclass, a demonstration. The target was the inexperienced, poorly led, and dangerously exposed American Second Corps. The attack was set for February 14th, Valentine's Day, 1943. Under the cover of a sandstorm in the pre-dawn darkness, the engines of two panzer divisions, the 10th and the 21st, roared to life. This was not a cautious probe, it was a spear thrust aimed directly at the weakest point in the American line, the exposed and isolated positions around Sidi Bouzid. For the American soldiers of the 1st Armored Division scattered in small, unsupported outposts, the first sign of disaster was not the sight of tanks, but the sound. A terrifying, wailing siren that seemed to tear the sky apart. The Junkers Ju-87A. These were not strategic bombers, they were precision instruments of terror. They dove almost vertically, their sirens screaming, dropping bombs with pinpoint accuracy on American command, posts, artillery batteries, and communication lines. The physical damage was significant, but the psychological impact was devastating. The Stukas were the scalpel that began the dissection. They severed the nervous system of the American defense. Telephone wires were shredded. Radio antennas were blown apart. In minutes, platoon were cut off from companies, companies from battalions. Commanders were suddenly blind and deaf. Their units isolated islands in a sea of noise and chaos. Then out of the dust and smoke came the panzers. The German attack was a textbook example of combined arms. The Gefecht der Verbunden and Waffen executed with the brutal efficiency of a master craftsman. The tanks of the 10th Panzer Division didn't attack the American strongpoints head-on. They flowed around them like water finding cracks in a faulty dam, cutting them off, surrounding them, leaving them for the German infantry that followed. The American response was slow, confused, and tragically by the book. The initial reports that reached the rear were fragmented and contradictory. From his command bunker 70 miles away, General Friedendahl couldn't form a coherent picture. His instinct, bred from peacetime maneuvers, was to order a counterattack. He directed Combat Command A under Colonel Thomas Drake to move on City Bid and push the Germans back. It was an order that sent an entire armored battalion to its doom. Colonel Drake's men moved out with the confidence of an army that believes in its equipment. They had the new M4 Sherman tank, a machine they had been told was superior to anything the Germans had. As they advanced across the flat open plain, they spotted German panzers. The American tankers opened fire. A few German tanks were hit. The rest appeared to turn and fall back. It was bait. Drake's battalion, eager for a victory, surged forward in pursuit. They were driving directly into one of the most practiced and lethal traps of the Desert War. As they crested a low ridge, the trap was sprung. It wasn't the panzers that engaged them. It was something else. From concealed Dugan positions, a screen of 88mm anti-aircraft guns opened fire. For the American tank crews, it was incomprehensible. One moment, they were chasing a retreating enemy. The next, their world was exploding. The 88's high velocity shells were not like artillery. They were flat trajectory, point-and-shoot weapons of surgical lethality. They didn't just damage the Shermans. They tore through their armor as if it were cardboard, a flash, a deafening crack, and another American tank would brew up in a plume of black smoke. The American training doctrine had failed them. They had been taught to stop, aim, and fire, a static range practice mentality. The German tank crews and anti-tank gunners were masters of movement and position. They fired on the move, used the terrain for cover, and picked their targets with chilling precision. The Americans, exposed and silhouetted on the open plain, were simply being executed. The communications breakdown was now absolute. Artillery commanders, desperate to help, couldn't get target coordinates. The few forward observers who still had radios were screaming for fire support on positions that were constantly shifting. The air support that was supposed to protect them was nowhere to be seen, locked in its own, separate, uncoordinated war. On the ground, the American units disintegrated. This was not a tactical withdrawal. It was a systemic collapse. Command structures evaporated. Officers who tried to rally their men were cut down or simply overwhelmed by the tide of panic. Soldiers, many of whom had never heard a shot fired in anger before that morning, abandoned their vehicles and weapons and simply ran. They streamed eastward in twos and threes, then in disorganized mobs, leaving behind a battlefield littered with the burning monuments to their inexperience. By the end of the day, Combat Command A had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Of the 53 Sherman tanks that had begun the counterattack, 44 were smoldering wrecks. Over 1,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured. For the German veterans of the Afrika Korps, it was a stunning, almost effortless victory. As they consolidated their positions and surveyed the carnage, they were not just celebrating, they were analyzing. The Panzer commanders noted how the American tanks bunched together, making them easy targets. The Schuka pilots saw how vehicles were parked in neat rows, begging to be strafed. The infantrymen who rounded up dazed prisoners were struck by their opponents' apparent shock and lack of fight. The evidence seemed overwhelming, a clear and unambiguous verdict on their new enemy. The American army was a brittle, hollow force, rich in equipment, but poor in spirit, led by incompetent officers and utterly unprepared for the realities of modern war. The rout was total. The lesson for the Germans seemed obvious. They believed they were looking at the true, unchangeable nature of the American army. The aftermath of the battle was a landscape of American failure preserved for German inspection. In the days that followed, the scale of the disaster became terrifyingly clear. The final tally was a butcher bill for an army that believed it was invincible. Over 6,000 American casualties. More than 3,000 men were now prisoners of war, their war ending just as it had begun. The material losses were even more staggering. Nearly 200 tanks, including dozens of the new M4 Shermans, were destroyed or simply abandoned. Hundreds of trucks, half-tracks, and artillery pieces littered the desert floor. For the German soldiers of the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions, it was a scavenger's paradise. They walked through a museum of abandoned American might. They found brand new Jeeps with keys still in the ignition and full tanks of gas. They discovered supply trucks laden with rations, cigarettes, and coffee, luxuries the long-suffering Africa Corps hadn't seen in months. They inspected captured Shermans, marveling at the quality of their construction, the radios, the comfortable crew compartments, and they were baffled. Many of these machines were completely undamaged, abandoned in sheer panic. One German officer noted in his diary that it was as if the Americans had intended to gift them an entire armored division. The material loss was bad, but the evidence of moral collapse was far worse. The image of German infantrymen posing for photos at top pristine, captured American tanks was a symbol of not just a military defeat, but a psychological one. This evidence formed the foundation of a swift and confident German diagnosis. In their field reports and after-action analyses, German officers painted a portrait of their new enemy that was detailed, consistent, and damning. This wasn't propaganda meant for the radio waves, it was a cold, professional military assessment for their superiors. The conclusion was unanimous. The American Army was a paper tiger. Veteran panzer commanders noted how American tank crews advanced in clumsy parade ground formations, making them easy targets for experienced gunners. They observed a complete lack of fire and maneuver, the basic building block of armored warfare. Infantry officers were shocked at how quickly American soldiers surrendered once their units were broken up and their officers were lost. Men who were isolated seemed to possess no individual initiative, no instinct to form ad hoc groups and fight on. They simply gave up. The most damning critique was reserved for the American command structure. German intelligence listening to radio traffic had been astonished by the lack of discipline. The Americans chattered constantly on open frequencies, giving away positions and intentions. Their attempts to coordinate infantry, armor, and artillery were described in German reports as infantile. The different branches of the American military seemed to be fighting three separate wars on the same piece of ground. A German captain from the 10th Panzer summarized the consensus. "The American soldier is a good man. I am sure he is just badly led. His officers are afraid of the front, and they do not know their trade." This assessment, compiled from dozens of eyewitness accounts, solidified into a dangerous piece of doctrine. The American was materially strong but morally weak. He lacked the warrior spirit, the Kampfgeist that the German military believed was the true key to victory. Field Marshal Rommel reviewing. The report saw his own initial impressions confirmed. He had defeated not just an American corps, but the very idea of the American soldier as a credible threat. And in Berlin, the High Command took note. The victory at Kasserine was so absolute, it provided a simple, comforting answer to the question of America's entry into the war. Industrial might could be overcome by superior tactics, experience, and will. The diagnosis was complete. It was logical. It was based on overwhelming evidence, and it was about to become a fatal illusion. While the Germans were cataloging their victory, the shockwaves of the defeat were hitting Allied force headquarters in Allers with the force of a physical blow. The news came in fragmented, chaotic reports, units that had ceased to communicate, commanders who couldn't be found, entire battalions that had simply vanished from the map. For General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, this was more than a battlefield crisis. It was a threat to the entire strategic foundation of the war. The North African campaign Operation Torch was his first major command. It was the first test of the Anglo-American alliance, an alliance already strained by professional rivalries and differing strategic visions. The British, with years of hard-won experience against Rommel, had been skeptical of their American partners' readiness. Kasserine was their skepticism made real. Eisenhower knew that if the American army was seen as an unreliable, brittle force, his authority as supreme commander and America's role as a senior partner in the war would be fatally undermined. His anger was cold and methodical. He was a master of coalition politics and diplomacy. But beneath the famous grin was a core of pure steel. The reports were not enough. He needed to see it, to feel it. On February 25th, ignoring the risks, Eisenhower flew to the ravaged front of the Second Corps. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. It was not just a scene of defeat. It was a scene of systemic failure. He saw the wreckage, the abandoned equipment, the shell-shocked faces of the survivors. He spoke with commanders who had lost control of their units and soldiers who had no idea where their officers were. He saw the remnants of Freyre-Dahl's divisions broken and scattered, and he understood. The problem wasn't a lack of courage among the enlisted men. The problem was at the top. It was a disease of leadership. And the primary source of the infection was the man he himself had put in charge. Returning to his headquarters, Eisenhower sat down to write a cable to his superior, General George C. Marshall, in Washington. It was a masterpiece of controlled fury and ruthless self-assessment. He admitted the failure was his responsibility, and then he made one of the most difficult and consequential decisions of his career. He was going to clean house. The instrument of that cleansing arrived in Tunisia like a thunderclap. On March 6, 1943, Lieutenant General Lloyd Friedendahl was relieved of command. The man sent to replace him was his polar opposite in every conceivable way, General George S. Patton, Jr. Patton's arrival was not a quiet transition. It was an occupation. He descended upon the demoralized Second Corps headquarters with the fury of an Old Testament prophet. His first act was to inspect Frieden's infamous command bunker, blasted out of a hillside 70 miles from the front. Patton took one look at the elaborate mole-like fortress and turned away in disgust. He immediately ordered the Second Corps command post moved to the front into tents where he and his staff would be just as vulnerable as the men they were leading. The message was instantaneous and clear. The age of remote control warfare was over. Then came the regulations. Patton was horrified by the lax discipline, the sloppiness that he saw as a direct reflection of a defeated mindset. Within 24 hours, he issued a series of now legendary orders. Every man, from private to general, would be in proper uniform at all times. Helmets were mandatory. Neckties were to be worn. He imposed a $25 fine for any soldier caught with his uniform unbuttoned. To the weary soldiers, it seemed like madness. They had just survived a mauling by the Afrika Korps, and their new general was worried about neckties. But it wasn't madness. It was shock therapy. Patton understood that discipline is a muscle. If a soldier couldn't be trusted to follow a simple order like wearing his helmet, he couldn't be trusted to hold his ground under fire. By enforcing these small, visible standards of military bearing, he was rewiring the entire culture of the Second Corps. He was forcing them to act like soldiers again in the belief that acting the part was the first step to becoming the part. He was a whirlwind of personal energy. He roamed the front in his command car marked with oversized stars and a blaring siren, deliberately drawing attention to himself. He would show up unannounced at a battalion headquarters, inspect the mess kits, taste the food, and question the junior officers. He fired incompetent commanders on the spot without hesitation, ruining careers with a single sentence. But he also promoted men who showed initiative. He spoke to the troops not in the vague platitudes of Friedendahl, but in a language of raw, profane, and brutal aggression. He told them they were going to kill Germans. And he told them exactly how they were going to do it. He was arrogant, theatrical, and ruthless. And he was exactly what the broken Second Corps needed. He was not just commanding an army, he was forging a new one through sheer force of will. The real test, however, would not be on the parade ground. It would be in the next battle, and it came sooner than anyone expected. The Germans, believing the Americans were still shattered and passive, continued their offensive. Rommel pushed east, hoping to deepen the crisis, but he was no longer facing Frère-Édouard's army. He was about to encounter Patton. The clash came in late March and early April, in a series of brutal engagements around a dusty crossroads called Elgatar. This time, when the panzers of the 10th Division attacked, the Americans did not break. The infantry of the 1st Division, the big red one, dug in and held their ground. They had learned the hard lessons of city build. They used the terrain. They dug deep. And they fought back with a stubbornness the Germans had not seen before. But the most significant change was the artillery. At Kasserine, American artillery had been a non-factor, poorly coordinated and slow to respond. At Elgatar, it was a killer. Under the new aggressive leadership, artillery observers were pushed far forward with the infantry. Communication was clear and direct. When the German panzers began their main assault, they ran into a wall of high explosives. In one of the most effective displays of American firepower in the war to date, the masked artillery of the Second Corps caught an entire German tank battalion in the open. In a matter of minutes, over 30 panzers were destroyed or disabled. Their attack shattered before it had even truly begun. The Germans were stunned. They regrouped and attacked again, but the American line held. They did not win a glorious sweeping victory. They did not encircle and destroy the 10th Panzer Division. But they did something far more important. They did not lose. They took a punch from one of the Wehrmacht's best units, and they punched back. For the first time in North Africa, a major German armored assault against American forces had been stopped cold. From the German perspective, however, this new American resilience was not seen as a sign of systemic transformation. It was viewed as an anomaly. Their after-action reports noted the stubbornness of the 1st Infantry Division, but they attributed it to that unit's specific quality. It was a veteran formation. They noted the effectiveness of the artillery, but dismissed it as a lucky break. Their fundamental diagnosis from Kasserine remained intact. They had faced a tougher fight, yes, but they still believed they were facing the same army. They had won the first battle so decisively that they were now unable to correctly interpret the second. The East Americans had learned from their failure. The Germans, tragically, had learned the wrong lesson from their success. This lesson was about to become official doctrine. The German campaign in Tunisia ended in May 1943, not with a bang, but with a surrender. Over 250,000 seasoned German and Italian soldiers laid down their arms. It was a strategic catastrophe for the Axis, and yet salvaged from the wreckage of the Africa Corps was a piece of intelligence so compelling, so seemingly definitive, that it was treated in Berlin as a victory in itself. This was the Kasserine diagnosis, the final formal portrait of the American army. The reports from Rommel, from the commanders of the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions, and from the intelligence officers who interrogated thousands of American PWs, all flowed back to the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German Armed Forces High Command. When compiled and analyzed by the intelligence branch, FMA West, Foreign Armies West, a remarkably consistent picture emerged. It was the picture of a second-rate army. The official German assessment was not a crude caricature. It was a detailed, professional, and deeply flawed analysis. It acknowledged American material strength, noting the high quality of their equipment and the depth of their logistical train. But this strength was seen as a crutch, a substitute for real fighting ability. The core of the diagnosis lay in what the Germans called Kampfgeist, the spirit of battle. And in this, they judged the Americans to be profoundly deficient. The German analysis concluded that American soldiers lacked individual initiative. They were effective only when operating under direct orders within a rigid command structure. Once that structure was broken, once their officers were lost or communications were cut, they were prone to panic and surrender. Their junior officers were seen as products of a peacetime by-the-book mentality, incapable of the rapid, independent decision-making that was the hallmark of the German NCO Corps.
The storm was gathering.
The American doctrine of combined arms was judged to be a theoretical ideal, not a practiced reality. At Kasserine, the different branches had fought their own separate wars. The Germans saw no reason to believe that could change. This diagnosis was not filed away in a dusty cabinet. It became the bedrock of German strategic planning for the most important battle of the war in the West, the coming Allied invasion of France. Facing a two-front war of attrition, with the bulk of its elite divisions bleeding out on the Eastern Front, Germany could not afford to be strong everywhere. Its strategy for defending Fortress Europe had to be based on a clear and accurate understanding of the enemy, and Kasserine provided a simple, comforting, and dangerously wrong model. The prevailing logic inside the German high command went like this: the Americans are morally brittle. They have no stomach for heavy casualties. Therefore, the invasion must be defeated on the beaches in the first 24 hours. If the landing force can be hit with overwhelming, concentrated violence at the moment of its greatest vulnerability, as it struggles through the surf, its morale will shatter. The carefully planned invasion will dissolve into chaos. Kasserine Pass on a continental scale. Such a catastrophic failure, it was believed, could create a political crisis in Washington and London, possibly forcing the Allies to the negotiating table. The entire defense of the West now hinged on a single psychological premise. The American army would crack under the first hard blow. This theory was aggressively pushed down the chain of command. Throughout late 1943 and early 1944, commanders assigned to the Atlantic Wall were briefed on the nature of the enemy they would face. They were told to expect an army that was clumsy in its tactics, slow to react, and whose soldiers would give up when isolated. They were being trained to fight the American Army of February 1943. In one of the war's great ironies, the man put in charge of strengthening the Atlantic Wall defenses was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. The Desert Fox was now tasked with preparing for an invasion by the very army he had so thoroughly humbled. His experiences in Tunisia informed his every decision. He argued relentlessly with his superior, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, insisting that the only way to win was to hold the panzers close to the coast, ready to strike the moment the first Americans hit the sand. Rommel's strategy was a direct product of his diagnosis. The Americans could not be allowed to establish a beachhead because once ashore and organized, their material superiority would become unstoppable. The fragile invader had to be annihilated at the water's edge. While the Germans were diligently building a strategy to defeat a memory, the real United States Army was being reborn. The shock of Kasserine had triggered a ruthless process of institutional change. Throughout England, vast American armies trained with a new and desperate intensity. Doctrine was rewritten. Communication procedures between ground and air forces were completely overhauled. Hundreds of ineffective officers were quietly removed and sent home. The lessons paid for in blood in Tunisia were now required reading for every commander, from platoon leaders to generals. The U.S. Army was studying its failure, while the German Army was studying its success. One was learning how to adapt. The other was learning how to be complacent. For more than a year, the German military machine prepared itself to fight the ghost of Kasserine Pass. In June 1944, on the beaches of Normandy, it would finally meet the real thing. June 6, 1944, the Atlantic Wall. For the German soldiers peering out from concrete bunkers, the first reports are a mix of terror and grim opportunity. The invasion has come. But for the commanders in the rear, this is the moment the Kasserine diagnosis will be put to the test. This is the moment the plan is activated. The orders flash down the line to the panzer divisions held in reserve. Move to the coast. Counterattack. Annihilate the enemy at the Watt's edge. The logic is crisp and confident, born from the lessons of Tunisia. A sharp, violent blow against the beachhead will cause a panic. The American command structure will seize up. Their fragile morale, as diagnosed and documented, will shatter. The entire invasion, they believe, will collapse into a continental-scale Kasserine Pass. Field Marshal Rommel himself, the architect of both Kasserine and the Atlantic Wall defenses, has built his entire strategy on this single overriding principle. The Americans must be broken in the first 24 hours. They must not be allowed to get organized. The German High Command is not preparing to fight a war of attrition in Normandy. They are preparing for a psychological execution. But as the veteran panzer divisions begin to roll, the plan immediately collides with a new and terrifying reality. The first sign that the diagnosis is fatally wrong does not come from a tank gun. It comes from the sky. In 1943 in Tunisia, the Luftwaffe could still contest the air. In 1944 over Normandy, the sky belongs to the Allies. It is an alien sky, a constant menacing presence buzzing with swarms of fighter bombers the Germans call Yabos. For the panzer crews on the roads, the journey to the front becomes a nightmare. They are not moving to a battle. They are the battle. American P-47 Thunderbolts and British Typhoons circle overhead like birds of prey, hunting for any sign of movement. A column of tanks, a fuel truck, a single staff car. Anything on the road during daylight is a target. The panzers, the instruments of the planned lightning counterattack, are forced to hide in forests, to move only at night, inching toward a battle they are already losing. The swift, decisive blow that was supposed to shatter American morale never lands. It is broken up piece by piece from the air by a form of combined arms warfare the Germans had pioneered, now turned against them with overwhelming industrial might. Those German units that do reach the front expecting to face the brittle amateur army from their intelligence reports find something else entirely. The fighting in the dense hedgerow country of the Bocage is brutal, a close-quarters knife fight. A German machine gun team sets up in a thicket commanding a field. In 1943, this would have triggered a clumsy, costly, and ultimately failed American infantry assault. In 1944, what happens next is not a battle, it is a process. The American infantry platoon pinned down does not charge. The lieutenant does not order a futile attack. He gets on the radio. A forward observer crawling in a ditch 100 yards away calls in coordinates. Within minutes, a sound rips through the air. The freight train roar of incoming shells. An entire battery of 105mm howitzers miles away has been assigned to this single machine gun. The shells don't just land near the target, they walk back and forth across the position. A systematic eraser of a single point on a map. When the shelling stops, there is no more machine gun, there is no more thicket, there is only churned earth. The German veterans, masters of their craft, are stunned. They are fighting phantoms. They are being killed by an enemy they cannot see. A German Panzer IV commander, a veteran of the Eastern Front, hides his tank in a barn, waiting to ambush an American column. A single shot could knock out a Sherman and stall the entire advance. But before he can fire, a light reconnaissance plane, a Clears-Throat Piper Cub, drones lazily overhead. The pilot sees the tracks leading into the barn. He circles, drops a smoke marker, and radios the position. The Panzer commander doesn't even know he's been spotted until the first rocket from a P-47 Thunderbolt tears the roof off the barn. The Americans are not fighting with spirit, they are fighting with a system. A vast, interconnected network of observation, communication, and overwhelming firepower. It is methodical, impersonal, and unstoppable. The fate of the elite Panzer Lehr Division is the ultimate indictment of the Kasserine diagnosis. Formed from the hand-picked instructors of Germany's armored schools, it is arguably the most powerful single division in the Wehrmacht. Its commander is Fritz Bayerlein, a Rommel protégé who had witnessed the American collapse at Kasserine firsthand. He knows the enemy. He is confident his veterans can tear through them. In late June, Panzer Lehr is committed to the battle against the Americans. They expect to smash through the lines. Instead, they are fed into a meat grinder. The division is relentlessly pounded by artillery. It is hunted day and night by fighter bombers. Its tanks are picked off one by one, not in glorious duels, but by invisible artillery observers and unseen aircraft. After just a few weeks of combat, Bayerlein sends a desperate report to his superiors. His division, he writes, has been smashed and annihilated. He reports his tank strength is down to a handful. He concludes with a line that captures the dawning horror of the German command. The men are not in a state to fight. They have been morally beaten. Morally beaten. It is the exact phrase, the precise diagnosis the Germans had applied to the Americans a year before. Now it was being reflected back at them, magnified 1,000 times. The German soldiers in the hedros are not being defeated by superior courage or brilliant tactics. They are being crushed by an industrial process of war they have no answer for. One captured German general, when asked to explain the difference between the front in Russia and the front in Normandy, gives a simple, chilling answer. In Russia, when we saw a column of tanks, we prepared the anti-tank guns. In Normandy, when we see a column of tanks, we go to the air raid shelter. The German High Command had made a fatal error. They had mistaken a single data point for the entire curve. They had won a battle against a student and then spent the next year preparing to fight that same student again, never imagining he had spent that time studying, training, and graduating. The army they had dismissed as soft, amateur-ish, and poorly led was now systematically dismantling the very best of the Wehrmacht. The Kasserine diagnosis, the brilliant analysis that had seemed so clear and so useful, was not a key to victory. It was a map that led them directly into a trap. They had looked at the American army in 1943 and seen the truth. But they failed to understand that for this new kind of enemy, the truth was subject to change. In the smoldering ruins of Normandy, a stunned German leadership was forced to confront a terrifying question. How did we get it so wrong? The enemy they had met in the hedge bore no resemblance to the one from their meticulously crafted intelligence reports. The army that was supposed to be brittle, poorly led, and prone to panic had instead demonstrated a relentless, systematic, and terrifying capacity for destruction. The Kasserine diagnosis, the intellectual foundation for their entire defensive strategy in the West, had not just been wrong, it had been a fatal illusion. The answer lay back in the dust and heat of Tunisia, in the very victory that had given them such confidence. Kasserine Pass was not a verdict on the American army. It was a lesson. And in one of the great ironies of the war, by winning so completely the Germans had accidentally become the world's best teachers, they had handed their inexperienced opponent the most valuable gift an army can receive, a perfect, unsparing, and brutally honest diagnostic of every single one of its weaknesses. They exposed the faulty command, the poor communication, the flawed tactics, the weak discipline. They created a flawless audit of everything that needed to be fixed. The Americans, to their credit, took the lesson to heart. The Germans, tragically, did not understand they had just given it. They had correctly identified the disease, but they failed to understand they had just triggered the immune system. The shock of Kasserine sent a jolt through the entire American military organism. The initial symptoms, the panic, the collapse of command, the abandoned equipment were severe. But what followed was not decay. It was a massive system-wide immune response. Ineffective leaders, the political generals like Friedendahl, were the first antibodies to be flushed from the system. New aggressive commanders like Patton were injected directly into the site of the infection. New doctrines for air-to-ground communication and artillery coordination were developed, like memory cells, ensuring the same mistake would not be made twice. The training regimen for troops back in England and the United States was radically altered, inoculating the entire force with the hard-won lessons from the front. The American army that landed on Omaha Beach was not the same entity that had been routed at City Bussard. It was the same body, but it now carried the antibodies of experience. It had been sick, it had survived, and it was now immeasurably stronger. This process was alien to the German military mind. The Wehrmacht's own self-image was built on an almost mystical concept of innate superiority, the warrior spirit, the KF Geist that was believed to be the birthright of the German soldier. They saw war